And I got all the technology right, put it away. As I mentioned last Wednesday evening, I'm beginning a series of Drashim, or sermons, in the book of Yahushua. My aim is to complete the whole book in 12 Shabbats, and then move on into Judges. And by the time we reach Pesach next year, we should be completed these two books. Then we can move on from there into the two books of Samuel and the two books of Kings. But anyhow, let's work on Yahushua in the meantime. As we have just completed another full cycle of Torah of Moshe, I thought it was a good idea that we cross the Yarden with Israel and continue the narrative that Moshe started and where he left off. Yahushua takes up the challenge. By passing on the mantle to Yahushua just days before Moshe's death, and through the blessing of Yahweh himself, Israel was enabled to cross the Yarden under the leadership of Yahushua. But before we begin those first two chapters that we read this morning, I want to give you a brief recap on the 5 books that lead up to the book of Yahushua. As we read in the first part of the Parashah, Bereshit, we need to focus again on what occurred to Israel before they actually got to crossing over the Yarden into the land they were going to inherit. The book of Yahushua is an unbroken continuation of the narrative of those first 5 books that make up the Torah, and which gives us a foundation for the people of Israel when they were taking possession of the land of Canaan. It must be remembered that Israel were entering the land because it was a promise by Yahweh that he made to Abraham at the time when Abraham himself was dwelling in that same area, in that same land. He was a sojourner, but he had no rights of ownership or rights of possession of any part of that land. But as the land became known as Eretz Israel, it belongs to Yahweh, and he always intended to evict the nations that were living in the land when Israel crossed over. So looking back through the 5 books of Moshe, we see that Yahweh prepared his people to take possession of the land as promised to Abraham. So starting in Genesis, we see through this book begins as a universal story or history of mankind. And then it becomes a particular history of just one family, the family of the patriarchs. Then moving on to Exodus, it takes us through the journey of Israel from slavery to nationhood in a period of less than 2 years. The book of Leviticus establishes the priesthood and the relationship it required between Yahweh and his people. The book also establishes how the sacrifices were to be brought before Yahweh at the Mishkan, or the tent of meeting. The book of Numbers begins with a census of all 12 tribes. It established the army that was necessary to displace the nations in the land. It also provided a way for the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt with the sons of Yaakov to be adopted into one of those 12 tribes. The book also covers the 38-year journey that first generation of Israel suffered in the wilderness, and all, apart from a few, died as a result of their contempt towards the promises of Yahweh. He made it clear they would not enter the land. Then finally, in Deuteronomy, it is set out like a treaty between a king and his subjects, and it would be required, what would be required of Israel when they actually enter into the land. They were going to be protected by Yahweh as tenants in his land, and he was going to be their king. The instructions given include how Israel is to behave in the presence of Yahweh. As long as they behaved and followed the commands of Yahweh relating to the sacrificial offerings which were required, they would be blessed. However, if they became comfortable in their lifestyle and turned aside from Yahweh and began to start offering sacrifices to foreign gods, he declared that he would ever increase the curses upon Israel until they were finally forcibly removed from his land. Having reached a reasonable depth of understanding, Israel was also instructed by Yahweh through Moshe that they were to read all the Torah and the commands on a regular basis and to put into practice all that they had been instructed. Finally, the second generation of Israel was ready to cross the Jordan under the leadership of Yahushua. But first of all, who is Yahushua? We're told that he is the son of Nun, N-U-N, of the tribe of Ephraim. His birth name was actually Hoshea, which means deliverance. However, Moshe changed it to Yahushua, meaning Yahweh is salvation. His new name was given at the time that he was one of the ones that reconnoitred the land of Canaan, where in Numbers chapter 13, verse 8, he was sent off as Hoshea. And when he returned, in verse 16b, we are told Moshe gave Hoshea, the son of Nun, the name of Yahushua. He, along with Caleb, were the only two who returned good reports that were pleasing to Yahweh. And that may well be the reason why Moshe changed his name. It also fits the name of Mashiach Yeshua, whose name, of course, is the same. It has the meaning, Yahweh is salvation. So Yahushua was a constantly loyal citizen and a loyal servant to Moshe. Throughout their time together in the wilderness, he was always with Moshe. His constant service to Yahweh may well have been the reason that he was appointed by Yahweh to be the leader after the death of Moshe to take the people into the land. So just some examples of how he served both Yahweh and Moshe are recorded in the book of Shemot, or Exodus. Firstly, as Israel were proceeding towards Mount Horeb, they were set upon by the Amalekites. Shabbat chapter 17 gives us a full account of how Yahushua led the battle to protect Israel against the forces of their enemies. Secondly, when Yahweh called Moshe to go up on the mountain to receive the tablets of stone, the only person who went with him and remained below the cloud was his assistant, Yahushua, as recorded in Shemot 24, verse 13. Thirdly, at Mount Horeb, before the Mishkan was built, Moshe would go outside the camp to what he called the tent of meeting, where he would meet with Yahweh on a regular basis. As recorded in Shemot 33, 7-11, every time Moshe had finished speaking with Yahweh, he would reappear from within the tent, but Yahushua remained inside the tent permanently at that period. So we see from these three examples that Yahushua was a constant assistant of Moshe and a faithful servant always at Moshe's side and in the service of Yahweh, which makes perfect sense that he would be chosen to receive the mantle of leadership from Moshe. His appointment was made in front of the whole of Israel. In Devarim chapter 31 verse 7, Moshe summoned Yahushua, and in the sight of all Israel said to him, "Be strong, be bold. You are going with this people into the land Yahweh swore to their ancestors that he would give them. You will be the one who causes them to inherit it." Now that statement, having been made in front of all Israel, meant that they had accepted Yahushua and that he had been appointed by Yahweh himself. So they were ready to follow his lead as they crossed the Yarden. So if you'd like to put up that slide. Caroline? Thank you. Great. Now that's a summary of an overview of the book of Yahushua. Now I've copied it off so you can take it home with you. You don't need to copy it all down now. But Yahushua's appointment. The opening 2 verses of the book confirm that Yahweh, through Moshe, selected Yahushua to be their leader. So the leadership begins with Yahweh saying to the people through Moshe, "Now get up, cross over the Yarden, you and all the people, to the land I am giving them, the people of Israel." Verses 3 and 4 spell out again the territory that Yahweh was promising to Abraham. So long he had promised to Abraham, so long before. But in verse 4, it gives a broad outline of the territorial boundaries, speaking about the land from the desert in the south all the way to the Levant in the north. Then it speaks about the east and west boundaries. The verse says the great river. Then it says the river, the Euphrates River. All the land of the Hittite onto the great sea in the west will be your territory. Now that's a rather misleading translation of the original Hebrew, because it speaks about the great river and then it gives a second phrase, the Euphrates River, which is erroneous because at no stage was the territory east of the Yarden ever promised to Yitzhak or Yaakov. The territory east of the Yarden, all the way to the great river of Euphrates, was only meant to be a promise to Abraham before Yitzhak was born. That means that the territory east of the Yarden was promised to Ishmael and his descendants, who are the modern-day Arab nations. However, somewhere in history, the idea crept in that it was promised to Israel. It appears to be a small error, but the consequences even today are massive, because the territory of Esau, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, which are combined as part of the kingdom of Jordan, are the rightful occupiers of that eastern territory. Israel is the only one that was ever promised the land west of the Yarden. But the Arab nations, of course, want everything west of the Yarden as well, right through the Mediterranean Sea. That was God's land that he promised to his people, Israel. So moving on to verse 5, Yahweh makes a very reassuring promise when he says, no one will be able to withstand you as long as you live. Just as I was with Moshe, so I will be with you. I will neither fail you nor abandon you. Even to this day, the Arab nations have tried to overpower the modern state of Israel, and they've always been repelled by Yahweh. In verses 6 through 9, Yahweh, through Moshe, reminds Yahushua that he must be strong and be bold in his leadership, and must constantly be reading the Torah of Moshe. In verse 7 it says, "Do not turn either to the right or to the left, then you will succeed in everything that you do." Yahushua was admonished to keep the Torah on his lips all the time, and to meditate on every word, night and day. Then he was to also act upon what he read in the instructions from the Torah. Finally, in verses 10 and 11, Yahushua began to take control of the situation. As those verses say, Yahushua instructed the officials of the people, go through the camp and order the people, prepare provisions, because in 3 days you will cross the Jordan, go and take possession of the land that God is giving you. Now this appears to be the first time that Yahushua has actually confronted the officials and the people as their new leader. He is preparing them for the crossing of the river in 3 days' time. Telling the people to prepare to cross over is no small thing. Chapter 5 tells us that it was about the beginning of the month of Aviv when they crossed, just 2 weeks before Pesach. But Scripture does not tell us that at that time of the year, the Jordan was in full flood. All normal crossing points would have been deep underwater, which would render the crossing impossible. So Yahushua was effectively asking for the impossible. No wonder Yahweh said, "Be strong and be bold." To ask the people to do something that is impossible is not the ideal way for a new leader to start his leadership. Imagine if I said to you, in 3 days we'll walk across the Tuki River. You'd probably say, okay, that's reasonable. It's a stony bed, we can get across. But if I asked you to cross the Waikato River at Huntly in the middle of winter, you'd think I'd gone completely mad. It's deep, it's wide, it's fast flowing. There's no way we would get across. And that was what Yahushua faced when he was giving this first instruction to the people. At that stage, it appeared that even he did not know just how Yahweh was planning to get them across. He just had to trust that Yahweh had the situation in his control. That was the sort of man he was. While he had the whole community assembled, he reminded them again what Moshe had said to the people of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh about establishing themselves on the eastern side of the Jordan, because the pastures were lush on that side of the river. They had many cattle and many sheep, and they wanted to settle their home permanently on that eastern side. Moshe had agreed to their request on the condition that the men went ahead of the other tribes to evict all the nations west of the river. So having told the whole community to prepare to cross in 3 days' time, and having received confirmation that Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh were prepared to cross, Yahushua receives the most unexpected response to his commands. In verses 16 through 18, we're told, it says, "We will do everything you have ordered us to do. We will go wherever you send us. Just as we listen to everything Moshe said, we will listen to you. Only may Yahweh your God be with you as he was with Moshe. If anyone rebels against your order, does not heed what you're saying, in every detail of your order, he will be put to death. Just be strong, be bold." That's the response from the people. Amazing as it sounds, all the people were throwing their support behind their new leader. It appears that they had come to the realization that if they failed to support Yahushua, they may very well die on the plains of Moab, just as their fathers had died in the wilderness. It must be remembered that the current officers and the leaders of the clans and the tribes were all teenagers and infants when the 10 spies came back with the bad reports. Only Yahushua and Caleb survived. All those other leaders, all the people of that first generation, all died in the wilderness. So this second generation had probably realized that Yahweh had been with Yahushua all the way through the wilderness experience. So it was fitting for them to put their faith in him as their leader. So if they were going to cross the Jordan, they had to trust that Yahushua would be able to make things happen with the backing of Yahweh. They didn't know what was going to happen, and probably Yahushua didn't know either, but they had to trust. So that brings us back to the end of chapter 1, with Yahushua firmly in charge. Next, the focus changes from establishing the leadership to his next role as a military commander. In chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, Yahushua sends out 2 spies across the river to reconnoiter the city of Jericho and, of course, the surrounding country. It did not take long for the news to spread that there were spies in the city. Possibly divine guidance led the 2 spies to the house of Rachav, a prostitute, where they spent the night. In verses 3 through 14, it tells us about the spies managing to escape from the king's men who had been dispatched to arrest them. Rahab hid them and lied to the king's men, or the king's officers. In verse 4, she said, "Yes, the men did come to me. I don't know where they came from." But she did. "The men left around the time that the gates are shut, when it was dark. Where they went, I don't know." She hid them on the roof. "But if you chase after them quickly, you'll overtake them." This is one of the enigmas of Scripture. She told the officers a barefaced lie. Yet, as we see in chapter 6, she and her whole family were saved when Jericho was destroyed by Yahweh. Her actions enabled the spies to escape and return to Yahushua with a good report of what they would encounter when Yahweh conquered Jericho. Her actions were so similar to many accounts of Gentile people in World War II who saved Jews from the Nazi forces. Many lies were told, many brave actions were taken, and many Jewish people lived as a result of those Gentiles being prepared to stand up, lie to the forces of tyranny, and openly lie about the situation. So it saved many Jewish lives. So rather than being rejected by Yahweh, Rahab went on to marry Solomon, who was the father of Boaz. Boaz marries Ruth. Then Boaz and Ruth became the great grandparents of King David, and of course the antecedents of Yahshua himself. So here's a prostitute in Jericho who's lying to the king, becomes the mother or antecedent of Yahshua himself. And these are some of the enigmas of Scripture. Returning back to Yahushua chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, Rahab makes a most interesting statement about how the people of Jericho felt about Israel when Israel was still on the other side of the river. Rahab says, "I know that Yahweh has given you the land. Fear of you has fallen on us. Everyone in this land is terrified at the thought of you. We've heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Sea of Suf ahead of you when you left Egypt, and what he did to the 2 kings of the Amori on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, that you completely destroyed them. As soon as we heard it, our hearts failed us. Because of you, everyone is in a state of depression. For Yahweh, your God, he is the God of heaven above and the earth below." Now just imagine how the nations of the world will feel when they see the return of Yahshua with his army of angels. As foretold in Revelation 6, verses 15 through 17, Then the kings of the earth's kings and the rulers and generals, rich and mighty, indeed everyone, slave and free, hid himself in caves amongst the rocks in the mountains, and said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us, hide us from the face of the one sitting on the throne, from the fury of the Lamb, for the great day of their fury has come, and who can stand? So what happened when Israel were preparing to go into the land will happen again to the nations who will face the return of Yahshua, who will bring his people back to the land. So as we saw in Ezekiel, it's all about return. Regardless of what they have done, his heart is still for his people because of the promise to Abraham. He will return them to the land just as he promised. So we see, in conclusion, we see that these two chapters, that when Yahweh stands up on behalf of his people, Israel, all the nations are reduced to a state of fear and depression. Yahweh has made a promise to Abraham about inheritance of the land. He has never dishonored that promise, and he never will. In spite of the wayward actions and the thoughts of Israel, Yahweh has made a promise, and we can be assured that he will carry it through to finality. So the whole conquest and settlement of Canaan by Israel only happened because Yahweh made it happen. But Yahweh would never have made it happen if it wasn't for Israel. So the two are inseparable. Yahweh makes it happen because of Israel, but he wouldn't make it happen unless there was Israel. The two are together. Shabbat Shalom.